Hello, everyone. Welcome back to your anatomy class. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the bones, the joints, the ligaments, as well as a few specific things of the foot, ankle, and toes. So let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at that, where we'll be able to see basically everything that we just talked about. But one thing that is also a little bit special about the foot is that you have arches. So that's kind of a pretty brief part, but we will be seeing that if you've ever heard of like the arch of the foot, it's not made up. It is something that exists. So we will take a look at that as well. So let's go ahead and start by taking a look at the bones of the foot, which are very similarly organized to the hand and fingers. So, I mean, luckily the names are pretty similar. So just the main thing that you need to do is replace the word carpal with tarsal. So instead of having carpals for the wrist, you have tarsals for the ankle. So the tarsals are going to be relatively large bones compared to the carpals, but these are going to be what form the ankle and heel, which connect to the rest of the foot, which, if you look closely, you have these long bones, just like going through the palm of the hand. These are called, in this case, metatarsals. And then each of the metatarsals extend out to one of your toes, which will be your phalanges. So your phalanges will be very similarly organized to your hand, where you can see that you have 3 different phalanges for digits 2 through 5. I know that's a little bit difficult with that yellow division, but proximal phalanx 2 in this case, middle phalanx 2 and distal phalanx 2 would be all along this toe. And then proximal phalanx 1 and distal phalanx 1 is all you have for the big toe, because just like the thumb, you only have 2. And then sesamoid bones, we'll be able to see just 2 of them, although you do have more, but these will be helping to support the ligaments and tendons for the most part. So to get started, let's take a look at the bones of the foot with just a focus on a couple of them really quickly. But you can see that you have the tarsals, which is this group back here, but then you have 2 really big tarsals back here. So you have the top tarsal, which is called the talus. That is this bone right here, which has a lot of different articular surfaces because it's going to be articulating with a lot of your different tarsals as well as your tibia. So your talus is going to have a lot of different articular surfaces, but it's still pretty big. But the biggest one is this bottom back one called the calcaneus, which is the heel bone. So this back here, if you see this really big rounded part on the back of the foot, that is your heel. So you can actually feel that very clearly. And then furthermore, if you've heard of, or if you recall, the calcaneal tendon, that was your Achilles tendon, which this is where it's going to attach to. So let's go ahead and just start by taking a look at the talus, where you'll have just a few different major regions that you'll need to see here, which will include like the head, the neck, the body, and then just a couple of like different things like trochlea and then sulcus tali. So to start off with, the head you can see over here. This is going to be along the anterior side. This is going to be where it's going to articulate with your other tarsal bones. So you can see it articulating with the navicular over here. Like this is going to be where you have the head, and then you have the neck, which is going to be where the head comes off of. And then the body is like the part that's more posterior, which is where the tibia is going to rest on top of. So you can see that you have a surface on the top, which is for the tibia, which is where you're also going to be able to find the trochlea. So like trochlea is kind of like a groove, remember? So this is where you're going to be able to find that. But then over here, along the side, or rather the back and bottom, this is where you're going to have the sulcus tali. So the sulcus tali is this like groove between the surfaces where it's going to articulate with the calcaneus. So yeah, a lot of articular surfaces on the talus. I mean, luckily, we're mostly just going to identify it as a whole, but it would be good to be able to orient yourself, because looking for these surfaces can be really helpful to orient yourself to the foot as well. So the talus is the second largest tarsal bone though, and this is going to be resting right underneath the tibia. Now the calcaneus is the biggest one, and biggest one has a few different parts to it, but luckily, I mean, some of them are pretty self-explanatory, which is like the body. So the body is going to be basically this really big part. So the body is like the central part, which is going to be where everything kind of like comes off of. But then if you look at the back and bottom of the calcaneus, this is called the tuberosity. So the tuberosity is going to be where you have most attachments around, and one of which being the biggest one is the Achilles or calcaneal tendon. So this tuberosity is the big bumpy part at the back and bottom of your heel where you're going to have tendinous and then ligament attachments as well, which will be aided by these different processes, which are called the medial and lateral process of tuberosity. So you'll have one on the medial side, one on the lateral side, and these will help with ligament and tendon attachments too. Now, you have a couple of kind of like more specific parts, I guess, one of which is called the sustentaculum tali. And this is kind of like a part that's going to be a shelf over the talus, or sorry, yeah, a shelf that's kind of like under the talus, rather, sorry. But that is where you can see this kind of like thing right here. This is going to be kind of like coming off of the side, and this is going to be that shelf thing. So this is going to be the sustentaculum tali, and you can see that here, as well as a little bit, although a little bit hard to tell, over here. So over here on the medial side, this is the sustentaculum tali. So this is where you'll have like the two different parts of the talus articulating with the calcaneus, and then right in between the two, if you remember on the talus, that's where you have that sulcus. But then you also have the fibular trochlea, which will be on the lateral side. So the fibular trochlea, that is going to be right over here. So calcaneus, that's going to be the biggest one, and it's the back and bottom of the ankle. Now the navicular bone, I mean, we're just going to look at the navicular bone itself, and you can see that it is actually directly anterior to the talus. So talus is here, navicular bone is right here, and on the top of the navicular bone, you have a tuberosity. But notice you have articular surfaces, both on the front and back. So those are going to be able to articulate with the talus, as well as these anterior tarsal bones called cuneiform bones. But before we get to the cuneiforms, you also have a lateral tarsal bone, which is called the cuboid bone. And you can see that right over here. So the cuboid bone here, as well as here, you can see that it's going to be articulating with the calcaneus, but like the navicular, it is going to have a tuberosity, which you'll be able to see, but this is kind of on the bottom / side of the cuboid bone. And then the cuneiforms, luckily, in contrast to the carpal bones, I mean, you don't have like 8 different names. In this case, you've got talus, navicular, calcaneus, cuboid, and then you've got cuneiforms, which is medial, intermediate, and lateral. So, yay. Okay, so take that for what you can. Like cuneiforms, you can see that there will be 3 cuneiforms, like one for like digit 1, or sorry, not digit, but metatarsal 1, 2, and 3. Which brings us to our metatarsals, which will be the long bones going kind of like through the majority or maybe half of the sole of the foot, which leads to your toes. So in a similar way to the metacarpals, you have a base, a shaft, a head, and then you have a tuberosity for the 5th metatarsal as well. So like these metatarsals are very similar to the metacarpals, which will be kind of like going through the foot to lead to the digits. So metatarsals, those will be going from tarsals to phalanges. And then likewise, the phalanges will be similar, but obviously, if you look at your toes and your fingers, they are definitely different in length and a little bit different in shape, but at least regionally and anatomically, they are pretty similar. So, I mean, you don't want your toes to be on your hands, but they're definitely similar in the way they're organized with the base, shaft, and head, but then also in their toe or in their like digits themselves. Remember that for digits 2 through 5, you have 3 phalanges, which is the proximal, middle, and distal. And then for digit 1, you have just proximal and distal. And keep in mind, you do want to number these based off of which digit it's going to. So like this would be proximal phalanx 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 respectively. And then even though you don't have a middle phalanx, you start at number 2 over on digit 2. So just regarding which digit you're on, that's the number of phalange you're going to be referring to. Now, this kind of specialized bone, in fact, well, mostly general type of bone, or at least shape-wise, you have something called a sesamoid bone. So these are just kind of like small bones that help to support tendons or ligaments. And we'll talk about 2 in particular, which are going to actually be along like one tendon, which is going to be the medial or tibial or lateral or fibular sesamoid bones. So you can see those here and here. So you have your hallux right here. This is your big toe. And then kind of right along the bottom of the metatarsophalangeal joint, this is where you have the lateral sesamoid and medial sesamoid bones, which will be kind of like right under the flexor hallucis brevis tendon. So flexor hallucis brevis tendon is going to be right along the top of it, or rather along the superficial or plantar surface of it. But then the dorsal surface is going to be like covered with hyaline cartilage. So it is in this joint region. You don't want the like bones to just like be in the middle and like kind of causing issues. It's going to be under this joint. It's going to have hyaline cartilage like where it contacts with the bones of the joint. But on the plantar side, on the more open side, that's where you have the tendon. All right. Now, as we look at these kind of bones of the ankle and foot, there are actually some different regions that we're going to be referring to. And luckily, they're pretty self-explanatory because it's either the front, back, or middle. So the front of the foot, where you find the metatarsals and phalanges, this region is going to be called the forefoot. So you actually do have kind of like specific movements for the forefoot, which will be similar to how you have certain movements for the rear foot or hind foot, which includes your talus and calcaneus. But in the middle here, between the two, I mean, in the middle, it's the midfoot. So rear foot, forefoot, midfoot. So taking a look at the foot, there are kind of some different kinds of actions than what you like have learned so far. And at the very least, even if they're similar, they do have some special names. So to take a look at this, first of all, like looking at this foot and ankle, depending on whether you bring your foot upwards or point it downwards, that is going to be referring to the side of the foot that it's going towards. So if you bring your foot upwards, that's going to be going up towards the top or back of the foot, which is called dorsiflexion. And then if you point your foot downward towards the bottom or sole of your foot or plantar surface, this is called plantar flexion. So if you're going to be like on your tippy toes, you're doing plantar flexion, and if you bring your foot up, that's dorsiflexion. So yeah, and then the next 2 movements are also a little bit special in that it's referring to the sole of the foot. So when you have inversion or eversion, this is when you rotate the foot kind of like on a sagittal plane. Like this is going to be where you rotate the foot inwards so that like the sole of the foot is towards the midline. That is inversion, or outward, which is going to be eversion. So inversion or eversion, this is the sole of the foot, so be careful of that. So if you are just like rotating the leg, that's a little bit different. So just be careful because sole of the foot is a little bit special in this case. And then abduction and adduction is another kind of like weird one, but this is where you're going to be moving mostly the forefoot. So like if you're moving the forefoot, like inward or outward, this is going to be abduction or adduction respectively. So abduction is always has been away from the midline, adduction is towards the midline, but then there's also one more definition for abduction and adduction in the foot, specifically for the toes, which is going to be like going kind of like towards or away from the center. But when you do abduction and adduction for the toes, they're actually respective to digit 2. So I know, like for the hand, everything was kind of like going away from or towards the middle finger, but for the toes, it'll be going like towards or away from digit 2. So we'll see that a lot more when we get to the muscles, but there's one more action which is a lot weirder than you'd expect. So everything else so far has been pretty much like uniaxial, like, I mean, just rotating in some way up and down. But now we have a different thing, which is called a triplanar movement, which is where it's going to actually involve all 3 actions in one. So this one is kind of the hardest to explain, but pronation and supination can be done for the foot as well, but it's a little bit different from what you'd expect. But let's just go ahead and take a look here. So pronation is going to include eversion, abduction, and dorsiflexion all in one. So notice, pronation is this one right here. You are lifting the foot up, you are pushing the sole outward, and then you're also going to be abducting, going away from the midline. So this is going to be pronation, where you lift up, away, and out. Now, supination is going to be the complete opposite, where you push your foot down, invert or bring the sole inward, and then bring your foot inward towards the midline for abduction 2. Now, this seems really complicated, which to some extent it kind of is, but when you actually kind of see it in practice, it's not as crazy as it seems. So, like, this is going to be like the neutral position, but when you do pronation, like, that's generally when your ankle is kind of like more inward. So, you're doing a few things here, which is going to be like pronation is bring your foot up. So like when your ankle goes inward, your foot goes slightly upward, outward, and then also like away from the midline. So I know. So this is something that's a little bit special about the foot, but like you can move your ankle in a specific way while it's stabilized against the ground, in contrast to the hand, which is usually a lot more free. So pronation and supination are kind of different, but just keep in mind that there's a lot of different actions that'll be involved with each of them. Okay, so now we need to take a look at the joints of the foot, which will be between a lot of those different tarsal bones, but then also you'll have ligaments that will support them as well. So to start off with, you have the subtalar joint. So the subtalar joint, I mean, what does that mean? Underneath the talus. So this is where it's going to have the part that largely is going to be it connected or articulating with the calcaneus. So notice that you have like the part of the calcaneus that is going to be kind of like rounded on top. This is going to be able to articulate with the concave portion of the talus. So the talus will sit on top of the calcaneus, which is going to form the subtalar joint. Now this is going to be a synovial joint. This is going to be a somewhat mobile joint, and it's going to be a multi-axial planar joint. So one of the big actions that it does here is supination and pronation. So like as you're like kind of like shifting your ankle, that subtalar joint with the calcaneus and then the talus on top of it, like this is going to be what's allowing you to do like a lot of those different actions. So supination and pronation, but then a lot of it is going to be like the calcaneal inversion or calcaneal eversion. So you can see that you have like the subtalar joint, which is just going to be between, well, it's hard to see, but you have the calcaneus and then the talus sitting on top of it, which allows it to kind of like rotate a bit up on top of it. So like most synovial joints, you're going to have a joint capsule. So this is going to be like right along like the outside of the articular surface. And then you'll have synovial membrane inside. So the synovial membrane helps it to stay lubricated as well as protect it using synovial fluid as well. But as you probably have expected at this point, but probably not super happy about, there's a lot of ligaments here as well. So in this case, I mean, luckily, once again, think about the names. It's a subtalar joint between talus and calcaneus. So these are going to be like named for that. Talocalcaneal will be like basically for all of them. So in this case, you have the lateral talocalcaneal ligament, and you can see that right here, a pretty small ligament, but it's still between talus and calcaneus. And then on the other side, you have the medial talocalcaneal ligament, which if you look closely, this is the sustentaculum tali right here. And then that's going to be allowing it to connect to the talus over here. So the sustentaculum tali, this is going to be where it connects with the medial talocalcaneal ligament. And then the posterior talocalcaneal ligament is right over here on the back. So notice that the calcaneus kind of like jets out a bit. And then this is where it's going to allow it to connect to the back of the talus. But then you also have something a little bit more internal, which is going to be the interosseous talocalcaneal ligament. So interosseous, between the bones, and you can see that kind of like within here, well, at least some of it over here. So this is the interosseous talocalcaneal ligament between the talus and the calcaneus. But something to kind of like keep in mind is like when you are moving your ankle, like certain joints are going to be able to support it for certain actions. So when you use the medial talocalcaneal ligament, so this one right over here, this is going to be taught during eversion. So if this is like the right foot in this case, this is the medial side. This is where you'll find the medial talocalcaneal ligament. And when you evert, this part is going to be stretched or taut. And then conversely, the lateral talocalcaneal ligament, this is going to be during inversion. It is taut on this side instead. So those two are somewhat self-explanatory, but interosseous talocalcaneal ligament, this is like kind of like over here, and this is going to be helping with being or like it will become taut during eversion as well. And then the posterior talocalcaneal ligament will become taut with inversion instead. So you've got your two that are like a little bit more self-explanatory, but then a little bit kind of like trickier. The posterior one is going to help with inversion, and then the interosseous one helps with eversion. So just try to keep in mind, like you have these different talocalcaneal ligaments that are going to be on like each side of the talus and the calcaneus, I mean, except for anterior kind of, but anterior is a little bit of the interosseous. Now looking at the midfoot, So going from like the hind foot, we now go to the midfoot, where we'll see a couple of different joints, the Talocalcaneonavicular ligament, or sorry, joint. So that is basically what all of the bones are kind of like encompassing, like talocalcaneonavicular. So all three of them are involved here. And then between calcaneus and cuboid, calcaneocuboid joint. So in this case, these also do help with like supination and pronation as well. But once again, like when in supination, primarily inversion, and pronation, primarily eversion. So these joints are going to be shifting and gliding past each other. So let's go ahead and just describe them real quick. So when we look at the talocalcaneonavicular joint, I know a lot of like things in there, but luckily it's very descriptive of what it is and where you find it. But here is your talus, which would be sitting right in here between your calcaneus and your navicular bone. So this right here, kind of like being encompassed or kind of surrounded here, this is your talus forming this joint with both of those bones. So instead of being like the superior part or the inferior part articulating with the posterior portion of the calcaneus, this is the anterior part, which is going to be still articulating with the talus, but then also now the navicular as well. So this is kind of similar to like a ball and socket joint, which has like those different articular surfaces, which allows it to do those different like gliding movements. So you can see that you have a rounded part of the talus as well as a convex part of the talus. Those are going to be parts that articulate with the calcaneus as well as the navicular. Now, the talocalcaneonavicular joint, I mean, as usual, is a synovial joint, so it has both the joint capsule as well as the synovial membrane. But then, if you look closely, there are a couple of different ligaments that we want to look for as well. So here is your calcaneus. Here is, it's a little bit hard to see, I guess, but here's your navicular bone, and then your talus is kind of like right above it. So it's a little hard to see, but down here, I mean, look, I mean, kind of like not really using the calcaneus not really using the talus between calcaneus and navicular bone. This right here is the plantar calcaneonavicular ligament, which has kind of like another name, which is the spring ligament. So this is going to be also connected to the sustentaculum tali. You can see that shelf coming off like over on the medial side of the calcaneus. And then that is where the plantar calcaneonavicular ligament is going to be connected to. So this is going to be helping to support the talus. Like the talus is kind of resting above this sustentaculum tali and this shelf, but then this ligament is going to be under it, helping to support it as well. But then on the back of the foot, or rather the dorsal side of the foot, I mean, it's a little small in this picture, but you can see that you have the dorsal talonavicular ligament, which is going to be right up here between the talus and the navicular bone. So exactly where you'd expect it, right on the back, talonavicular ligament. So the big one, I would suppose, is the plantar calcaneonavicular ligament, which you can see here connecting from sustentaculum tali over to the naviculum or navicular bone. Now, calcaneocuboid joint. So once again, getting to at least a little bit simpler stuff, you have calcaneal and cuboid, which is calcaneus and cuboid bones. So, I mean, calcaneus you can see here, and then cuboid you can see over here, which is on like the lateral side with the little toe. So calcaneus, cuboid, and then this is also a synovial joint. It's not as mobile, but it still does help with inversion and eversion. So the other ones so far, like the subtalar as well as the Talocalcaneonavicular joint, like the ones with all the like big smooth surfaces, those are going to be a lot more mobile. But this one, this is kind of just letting them fit together, but allowing some gliding as well. Now, looking at the Calcaneocuboid joint. So Calcaneus cuboid is right in front of it. So you can see just a little bit of it poking out like here and here. But this is where you're going to be able to see a couple of different like ligaments as well. So one of the big ones is the long plantar ligament. So long plantar ligament, you can see going along the anterior portion of the tubercle of the calcaneus, and then going along generally the bottom of the foot here. This is going to be connecting to the cuboid. So this is going to be connecting to the plantar surface of the cuboid, and being the long plantar ligament, it is a pretty prominent ligament, which is, as its name suggests, somewhat long. But underneath, like not going quite as far, you have the short plantar ligament, which is going to be right over here. So the short plantar ligament, or the calcaneocuboid ligament, this is going to be right underneath here. So you've got a long one with a short one kind of like right under it. But then you also have the bifurcate ligament as well, which is on the dorsal side of the foot. So if you look closely, this right here is your heel bone, the part that jets out here. This is the calcaneus, your heel. And then right in front of it, this is the cuboid, which, if you look closely, has this little part connecting the two, the dorsal calcaneal ligament. So while we're at it, I actually do want to kind of like point out a couple things. So notice that there's a lot of like ligaments down here, which a lot of them are going kind of between many of the different tarsal bones. But if you kind of move these out of the way, you can see that there are a couple of different ligaments that are coming from the leg region. So maybe this kind of looks familiar, but over here, like going over to like across the foot, this down here is fibularis longus. So fibularis longus, that's going to be like the one that has the longer tendon, and then fibularis brevis over here on the side. So fibularis longus is going to be going all the way along the bottom of the foot, and then fibularis brevis you can see over here as well. And then you can also see another pretty prominent one, which is the tibialis posterior, and that is going to be over here on the medial side of the ankle, but right behind the medial malleolus. So you can't see that, but that would be this first one, which then leads you to the next one, flexor digitorum longus, and then you have posterior tibial artery, tibial nerve, and then all the way back here, flexor hallucis longus. So you do see some of the tendons that we talked about earlier, and then hopefully this relates to some of the muscles that we talked about in the leg as well. Alrighty, so, oops, where were we? Here we are. All right, so the next thing that we have here are basically like our smaller, kind of like less, I mean, they're just smaller. So the smaller joints that you have here in the foot, naviculocuneiform, intercuneiform, cuboid navicular, like these are just like the rest, basically. So, but they're still like very indicative of like where you find them. Naviculocuneiform, that's going to be right over here. So between the navicular bone and the cuneiform bones. Intercuneiform bones. These are going to be between each of the cuneiforms, like of each other. And then cuboid navicular joint is like along the side between the two. Like that's going to be right in between those bones as well. And these just are also synovial joints. They do allow some amount of movement, which just is just allowing them to kind of like glide past each other, just like you saw in the carpal bones. So you do have the joint capsule, but you also have like little ligaments that connect them as well. But those are pretty minor, so let's go ahead and keep on going. Take a look at just a couple of other ones that we have here, like in the rest of the foot as well. So those were of the midfoot, but now you lastly have the forefoot, which will be largely between like the phalanges, the metatarsals, and then also the tarsals included in there as well. So tarsometatarsal joint, that is going to be this region right here. Metatarsophalangeal joint will be over here. And then interphalangeal joints, which include DIP, PIP, and then just IP for the big toe, those are going to be like over here. And then you do have some like joints between the metatarsals themselves, which will be intermetatarsal joints. So tarsometatarsal joints. So tarsometatarsal, like this is between the tarsals and the metatarsals. And I did bring this up slightly, but depending on which tarsal bone you're looking at, those are going to be articulating with a certain metatarsal for the most part. So the medial cuneiform over here is going to be articulating with metatarsal 1, middle, as well as medial and lateral to some extent. You can see over here and here is going to be articulating with metatarsal 2. And then metatarsal 3 is going to be articulating with the lateral cuneiform. And then 4 and 5 will be articulating coming off of the lateralmost tarsal bone, the cuboid bone. So this is where you're going to find like little ligaments kind of connecting across the joints. But first of all, joint capsule, synovial membrane, always included in synovial joints. But then you have the dorsal tarsal metatarsal ligaments right over here. And you can see them kind of like these tiny things right here. Those going between the tarsals and the metatarsals. I mean, on the dorsal side, exactly where you'd explained it, but then you also have ones on the front, or rather plantar side of the foot down here as well. So tarsometatarsal ligaments, those are connecting on either dorsal or plantar side, but then you also have the interosseous ligaments that are like much more in between and a little bit deeper as well. Now the metatarsophalangeal joints, so metatarsophalangeal between metatarsal and phalanges. So you can see the phalanges starting here at the very ends of the metatarsals, and that's exactly where you find these joints. Now this is where we get to kind of some more specific movements though. So instead of just inversion, eversion, supination, pronation, we do have some more actions that can happen here as they move the toes. So these joints, the metatarsophalangeal joints, are biaxial. Like they can move like along the sagittal plane, but they can also move along the transverse plane. Or like if they can move like side to side, basically. So flexion and extension is pretty self-explanatory, I would say. Like this is where they either bend or straighten. So I'm sorry, I shouldn't do that whole thing, but bend or straighten. So metatarsophalangeal joints, those can bend or straighten, but they can also abduct and adduct. So abduct and adduct is where you would go either away from the midline or towards the midline. So going towards or away from the center, these movements will be done in the metatarsophalangeal joints. So not in the like interphalangeal joints, but at the metatarsophalangeal joints. So this is where you'll find the joint capsule, the synovial membrane, but also collateral ligaments, plantar ligaments, and then deep transverse metatarsal ligaments as well, which are honestly kind of like hard to see for everything, but you have collateral ligaments, which will be on the sides. You have plantar ligaments, which will be on the bottom, which isn't super easy to see, but then you also have the transverse ligaments, which connect each of them kind of like to each other a bit. So keeping them like within a certain like range kind of together you have the deep transverse metatarsal ligaments, which connect between each of the metatarsophalangeal joints. Now, intermetatarsal joints. So intermetatarsal joints, these are going to be between the metatarsals. So here are your metatarsals again, and this is where you find your kind of joints between them, which is kind of what we were looking at before, like where you saw your deep transverse metatarsal ligaments. So you have these different ligaments kind of like connecting between them, and these are going to allow for some movement. Like these are not going to be the ones that are like flexing, extending, and so on. These are just going to allow for some like mobility between each other, but they're still kind of like kept together, both proximally and distally at the intermetatarsal joints. Now, interphalangeal joints is exactly what you've learned before, which is going to be the joints between the different phalanges. So in this case, you can see that you have one of your digits 2 through 5. This is your proximal, middle, and distal phalanx, proximal, middle, and distal. This is where you're going to have like your PIP as well as your DIP. So proximal interphalangeal joint and distal interphalangeal joint. So these will be able to allow for uniaxial movement, which is going to be flexion or extension. But just keep in mind that you don't always have this. You do have the big toe, which only has two, the proximal and the distal phalanx with the interphalangeal joint. So when we talk about the forefoot, like there are kind of some different types of movements to just keep in mind. So first of all, when we talk about the metatarsophalangeal joints, those were the ones between the toes and the foot. Remember, those can do flexion and extension, but they can also do abduction and adduction. So abduction and adduction are going to be going like away from or towards the center or towards like very similar, close to the center of the foot. But in this case, in contrast to the hand where they go along like the third digit, the foot is going to go like along like the second digit. So a little different, but if it's going to abduct, they're going away from the midline, which is the second digit. But if they're going to adduct, the toes will go towards the midline, which is in this case the second digit. So those are like specific actions of the metatarsophalangeal joints, flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction, and just keep in mind of that second digit thing. But the interphalangeal joints, like the ones that are like PIP, DIP, and IP, those are flexion and extension. They bend and extend. Now, I believe lastly, we're going to talk about the arches of the foot. So the arches of the foot are going to be like the kind of like curvatures that you find at the bottom of the sole of the foot. So you actually have three, the medial, lateral, and then transverse arches. So let's just take a look at this, and they're similar to what you'd probably expect. Like it is an arch that's going to be along both sides of the foot. So medial longitudinal arch, this is going to be along the medial side. So notice what bones are going to be kind of like forming this. You have like the anterior parts at the MTPs, and then you have the posterior parts at the calcaneus and the talus. So these are going to be like the ends of this arch, but then the keystone of the arch, or like the kind of top of the arch, is going to be the head of the talus. So this is going to be the kind of top of this arch at the head of the talus. Oh, sorry, head of the talus over here. So this arch is going to be the medial longitudinal arch, and it's connecting to the medial bone. So it's going to be going to the sesamoids of the great toe, as well as the heads of the metatarsals for 1, 2, and 3. So you can see those two sesamoids, as well as the heads of the metatarsals 1, 2, and 3, which are the medial toes. Now, on the other side, the other toes are going to be involved. So in this case, you'll have the anterior sides at the heads of metatarsals 4 and 5, but then you'll have the posterior portions being at, once again, the calcaneus. So just like before, the calcaneus was the posterior pillar. This is the posterior pillar as well. And then the keystone, kind of like the middle portion, in this case, not the talus, but will be the cuboid. So the lateralmost tarsal bone. So this is going to be the lateral arch. You can see the cuboid's right in the middle. This is going to be the keystone in the middle of this arch. And then the last one is the transverse arch, which transverse means it goes across. So this is going to be like kind of like how you'd expect like the carpal tunnel, but like not the carpal tunnel. So, but this is going to be the transverse arch, which is going to be where the tarsals kind of like form like a little bit of a bridge. So the transverse arch, once again, like you have like these different parts, which is going to be the lateral pillar being cuboid, medial pillar being medial cuneiform, and then in the middle, intermediate cuneiform or middle cuneiform being kind of like the top or keystone of this arch. Okay, so almost forgot about like some different major connective tissues, but some of them we actually already talked about. So let's just review a few things. So if you recall, you have some pretty big connective tissues that are going to be along the foot. So plantar calcaneonavicular ligament, this is going to be underneath the talus between the calcaneus and the navicular. And this is going to be connecting to the sustentaculum tali, going over to the navicular bone. But then you also have these pretty big ones over here, the long plantar ligament as well as the short plantar ligament. And these are kind of along the lines or along the plane of a muscle that we'll talk about called the quadratus plantae. So these are somewhat deep, which is going to be like the quadratus plantae over here. So I think this is supposed to say deep to superficial, but because these are definitely deeper than the plantar apner. Okay, never mind. So this is a list going from superficial to deep. So kind of got that a little bit mixed up. But yeah, you can see that you have the long plantar ligament, and then you have the short plantar ligament underneath. But then the plantar aponeurosis is something that we'll see as well, which is something basically on the very outside of the foot. So right underneath the skin, basically. This is where you find the plantar aponeurosis, which is going to be covering one of your major like plantar muscles, like the one that you see first, the flexor digitorum brevis. So the plantar aponeurosis is kind of like the palmar aponeurosis, where it covers like the very central and bottom, or in this case, the part that contacts a lot of stuff. This is a pretty thick connective tissue, which is kind of like a central thickening of the deep fascia. And this is going to be connecting to the calcaneus at the tuberosity. And then it's going to go to your metatarsophalangeal joints. So this is going to be extending pretty far to help with protecting the sole of the foot. But then you do have a couple of different retinacula as well, starting off with the ankle. I believe we talked about these, but let's just go over them again as well. Starting off with the anterior ankle, that's where you're going to find the extensor retinaculum. So this is where you'll have your superior as well as your inferior extensor retinaculum. And if you recall, your extensor retinaculum or your inferior extensor retinaculum has a Y shape to it. So you can see it bifurcates here, but you can't see the whole thing, but it does bifurcate to form like the Y shape that it's very distinct for. But then over here on the lateral side, this is where you'll have the fibular retinacula. So the fibular retinacula, that is going to be partially here and here. So this is going to be covering the fibularis longus and brevis. So fibularis longus and brevis, those tendons are going under the superficial or superior and inferior fibular retinacula. And then on the medial side, you have the flexor retinaculum. So medial side, medial malleolus, and then notice some stuff that you see here. This group of things we have a mnemonic for, which is Tom, Dick, and Nervous Harry. So if you recall that from the leg lecture, you might be able to notice a few things, which let's go ahead and take a look at real quickly, which is helping to form the tarsal tunnel. So tarsal tunnel, this is where you have the flexor retinaculum covering a group of tendons, which are going to be going under the foot along the bottom of the tarsal bones. So this is going to be the flexor retinaculum, helping to form like the roof of the tarsal tunnel. And then the floor of the tarsal tunnel will be the talus as well as the calcaneus. But then in here, this is where you have Tom, Dick, and Nervous Harry, which is flexor digitorum longus tendon. Or sorry. First one is Tom, tibialis posterior. The second one, Dick, flexor digitorum longus. And then and nervous, the red one, and is posterior tibial artery. And just to be clear, right, posterior tibial artery. Nervous, tibial nerve, and then hairy, this one that's kind of like right along the back, this is flexor hallucis longus. So I think that's about it. So if you have any questions, please let me know. But otherwise, that's it for today. So thanks for listening. Good luck with your studying, and I'll see you all next time.